Greetings, students. It's time for keywords and concepts from Chapter 12 on sex, gender, and sexuality. So the first thing we need to know from this chapter is what sex is, which I know sounds ridiculous, but for the purposes of this class, sex is physical or physiological differences between females and males. So this includes both primary sex characteristics and secondary sex characteristics such as height, muscularity, hair, that kind of thing. There are more than two, okay? Before we get on with it, there's two. No, there's not. Human beings are born with all kinds of combinations of genes. Now, anybody who is alive has an X chromosome, because if you don't have an X chromosome, you will die. But sometimes that second chromosome doesn't exist, and sometimes there's two. So people are born all the time XXY, XYY, XO, various combinations. So that's sex. When we're talking about sex, we're just talking about the physical differences, right? Those really visible things. Whereas gender is a whole bunch of other stuff. Gender is behaviors, personal traits, social positions that we attribute to being female or male. So if you think about it this way, there's nothing in biological wiring that makes women prefer pink to blue, right? That's silly. There's nothing in our genetics that's going to do that, right? But for some reason, society has associated that color with one sex and not the other. So that's when we're talking about gender, right? It's the social things, the things that we make up about the sex roles, which goes into gender roles. And gender roles are a society's concept about how men and women are expected to look and how they should behave. So this is the idea like women are supposed to stay home, men are supposed to go into the workforce, women are supposed to be compassionate, men are supposed to be aggressive. This kind of thing, right? These gender roles that we're supposed to inhabit. But if you've met more than 3 people, you know that doesn't really work. But they're still really prevalent, right? And why is that? Because of socialization. We really get into our socialization stuff. This stuff starts literally in the womb. It's amazing. More about that later. This also goes into doing gender, right? So this is actually the performance of your gender. So when you perform tasks or possess characteristics that are based on the gender role assigned to you. So what is an example of doing gender? Well, I do my gender when I put on makeup, right? That's a performance. I don't have to put on makeup. There's no biological requirement to put on makeup. But because I am female, society expects, to a certain extent, me to look a certain way, right? So that would be performing gender. All right, moving on. Intersex. Intersex is a general term used to describe people whose sex traits, reproductive anatomy, hormones, or chromosomes are different from the usual 2 ways that human bodies develop, right? We talked about the XXY folks, the XYY folks, all kinds of variations on that theme. Now, some of these traits are recognized at birth. Some of they can tell, there's a visible difference. While there are other people that don't find out until puberty or until they go to have kids, that they actually have a problem. And there's actually a lot of debate about whether or not we should include these folks in the LGBTQIA plus community, just because they're not. There's a lot of medical things going on here, right? That have nothing to do with a lot of the political things that have been associated with this, right? This is just straight up healthcare. So we have that as intersex. Sexuality is one's capacity to experience sexual feelings and attraction. It doesn't actually say anything about what you're doing with it. It's just the ability to do any of those things. Whereas sexual orientation, that's the physical, mental, emotional, sexual attraction to a particular sex, right? So sexuality, most human beings have some degree of sexuality, not all, but some, most. Whereas your sexual orientation is going to differ across different groups of folks. All right, one more in the section. I know it's kind of long. We have transgender here. This is when one's sex that was assigned at birth and their gender identity are not the same, right? So we use these abbreviations, AFAB, that means assigned female at birth. When you were born, they said it's a girl. Or AMAB, assigned male at birth, they said it's a boy. But as that human being grew up, they found that the social expectations that were placed on them were onerous, that they couldn't do it. It was so unnatural to them that they had to start living as the opposite sex. And this gets into gender dysphoria, which is a diagnostic category in the 5th edition of the DSM. It describes individuals who do not identify as the gender that most people would assume they are. There are lots of problems with this particular diagnosis, but it's getting better. But this dysphoria must persist for at least 6 months and result in significant distress or dysfunction to actually meet the diagnostic criteria. And most trans folks do have to go through some sort of diagnostic procedure before they can obtain gender affirming surgery. So that's why we learn, or gender affirming care, my apologies. So gender dysphoria is the actual clinical name for the thing that medical people are treating with gender affirming care. All right, so that's the diagnosis. All right, I'll be back with the next set. It should be shorter.